Hi, I'm Femi OK. Today on the stream, we are going to be talking about the Olympics. From now through to September, we are going to see some of the best athletes and para-athletes in the world competing in the Tokyo 2020 Olympic Games. But there is a dark side to this massive sporting event, and that is where I'm taking you today. Have a look at these pictures. Protesters in Tokyo protesting about what is going on inside the stadium and will be going on for the next couple of weeks. A sign of a growing anti-Olympics movement. Our guests will dig deeper into this movement and tell us so much more. Hello and welcome to Jules, Amira and also Taylor. So great to have you here on the stream. Jules, please introduce yourself. Tell everybody who you are and what you do.
Hello, my name...
Go ahead, Jules.
My name is Jules Boykoff, and I teach politics at Pacific University in Oregon. And I'm author of 4 books about the Olympic Games, most recently No Olympians, Inside the Fight Against Capitalist Megasports in Los Angeles, Tokyo, and beyond.
Good to have you. Hello, Amira. Welcome to the stream. Introduce yourself to our global audience.
Hi, my name is Amira Rose Davis. I'm an assistant professor of history and African American studies at Penn State. I study the intersection of race, gender, sports, and politics. I'm finishing my first book called Can't Eat a Medal: The Lives and Labors of Black Women Athletes in the Age of Jim Crow. And I'm also the co-host of the feminist sports podcast, Burn It All Down.
So great to have you. Hello, Taylor. Welcome to the stream. Introduce yourself to our viewers.
Hi there. My name's Taylor Carr, and I'm an activist and an organizer with No Olympics LA in Los Angeles.
All right, great to have you, guests. I just want to do something, just to have a look at all 3 of you and see where you stand as far as the Olympics is concerned. All right, so let me just ask Taylor and Amira, if you could make this Tokyo Olympics the very last one, would you, Taylor?
In a heartbeat.
Absolutely. He didn't even hesitate. That was less than a heartbeat. Amira, if you could make Tokyo 2020 the very last Olympic Games, would you?
Absolutely, as we currently understand it to be the Olympics. But I'm more for what can we put in its place.
All right, interesting. All right, Jules, if you could make this Olympics, this current Summer Olympics, the very last one of its kind, would you do that?
Just like Dr. Davis, if you have the Olympics as they are now, they need to go. No question about it.
All right. So let me ask you, audience, if you're watching on YouTube, you can be part of this show. Do you think the Olympics should be abolished? Our comment section is right there. You can be part of today's discussion. Please join us. Amira, I am looking on your Twitter feed, and you are posting about the Olympics.
I sure am.
So are you conflicted? Because I'm also posting about the Olympics too. What's going on here?
Yeah, no, I'm not conflicted because for me, I always try to center the voices of people, athletes, activists, people on the ground. And the way I hold space for that is to think about how athletes are navigating the institutions that we have a problem with. And those institutions are the same institutions that we're critiquing in terms of displacement and some of these other calamities that the Olympics bring. And so for me, if you're lighting a fire under the feet of the IOC or national federations, these big governing bodies, the institutions that are absolutely promoting these inequities, then you do that in multiple ways. And for me, that connection is through both athlete, activism, protest, navigating these structures, as well as what is being done outside and around and to mobilize against the games. And I think that there's a way that we even dichotomize it when athletes themselves tend to fall on a spectrum as well. And I'm all for mess. If anybody knows me knows I'm for mess and kind of chaos. But I think that sometimes you got to get a little bit murky to actually deal with some of these hard questions.
There was a sign I saw in the protest in Tokyo, I believe it was July the 21st, Jules, Olympics kill the poor. Can you make a connection between that sign and the reality of what happens to host countries and the places where the Olympics are being held to make that sign sound credible?
Sure. Well, first of all, the sign is credible. The Olympics tend to bring out the very best in Olympic athletes and at the same time, the very worst in the host city. And one of the ways that it brings out the worst is the way that the city treats the poor residents of that city as they get ready for the Olympic Games. And in city after Olympic city, the poor folks of the town are marginalized. They're often forcibly evicted from where they live. I've seen it with my own two eyes as a researcher in both London around the London 2012 Games. I also lived in Rio de Janeiro in 2015 and 2016, where I worked with favela communities that were getting forcibly evicted for the Games. So there's truth to that sign, no question.
I'm just looking here also at the headline, homeless people told they have no place in Tokyo Olympics. So that's from July the 22nd. So that's the most latest iteration of what happens to people who are unhoused. They don't have anywhere to go. So Taylor, let me just bring you in here from LA, because you are being an activist in LA against the upcoming Olympic Games and the pushback. I want to hear that from you. But first, I'm going to talk about LA and also Atlanta, the experiences from those two cities. Here are our commenters, and at the end of it, please pick up.
One of the main reasons that advocates and activists in Los Angeles oppose the Olympics is because of the impact it has on the unhoused community. We have 60,000 unhoused in Los Angeles, and the last time the Olympics came in, the city used that as a reason to displace, to criminalize, and to remove people from the streets.
In preparation for the '96 Olympics, nearly 9,000 Atlantans were taken off the streets and placed in the Atlanta City Detention Center. We know that this was to make Atlanta look like it didn't have a homelessness problem. The Olympics should be investing, creating long-term resources and opportunities for growth inside of host communities, not making existing problems worse.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, to your earlier point about the sign and the Olympics killing the poor, as a activist myself in the unhoused work that's very necessary here in Los Angeles, that's kind of how to No Olympics, because we started realizing, my partner and I, that at the apex of all this work is the looming 2028 Olympic Games. Already we see that a lot of real estate speculation and a ramp up of enforcement of homelessness and stuff like that around the city is being used with the Olympics as a bit of a cover. Even just this week, City Council passed a new ordinance that basically criminalizes existing in public space in any forms, with additional caveats that can be voted on and made even more severe by certain council persons in certain spaces in their own districts. And unfortunately, this is just the beginning. I live in Echo Park, and this year in April, we saw a very violent displacement of a community of about 200 people that were staying in the park. They had established this community with COVID. There were not any evictions or anything like that. And then all of a sudden, dozens of LAPD officers came in the middle of the night, pulled them out of these communities, put up a big fence, and have given them very little place to go, especially not really any permanent place. So yeah, unfortunately, it's very present, and we're already seeing it happening here in Los Angeles for the 2028 Games. And to connect it to Atlanta, it's been decades since the Atlanta Games, and we can see the scars on those communities still, and the way that those promises from the IOC never really came to bear much fruit.
Let me go to YouTube guests and put some of the thoughts from our YouTube commenters right to you. Jules, you take this one. Vince says, it's a huge waste of money and time. Jules, run with that one.
Well, there's no question that the Olympics have become a massive boondoggle. We've seen in Olympics after Olympics where bidders say it's only going to cost X amount of dollars, but when the games actually roll around, it's Y, and it's many times that. Tokyo is a prime example. Yeah. $7.3 billion it was supposed to cost, and now it costs, well, probably around $30 billion.
Jules, but would it be fair to add they also had to deal with a global pandemic and a postponement and no fans? But I take your point.
No, but actually, yes, that's a great point, but... Yeah. It was already about $28 billion, according to a Japanese audit, before the pandemic, and that just lacquered on another few billion.
It's so painful to hear that. All right, Amira, let me put this one to you. This is from Evelyn. It's fine having Olympics, but the Olympic Committee should or must reduce the expenses amount to build new stadiums. Could that solve problems? Amira, take that one.
That would just be that would absolutely just be a Band-Aid. And I mean, it's a good gesture,
Yeah.
but it's not like part of the infrastructure we're talking about here. Just to give a little bit of historical context, there was a report that came out from a housing equity group in Switzerland that estimated that from the 88 games in Seoul to the 2008 games in Beijing, roughly 2 million people were displaced. And that's just counting the Summer Olympics. That is a massive number. It's also about the militarization. It's also about the way that profit is centered over health of communities, of athletes, of everybody in the infrastructure of these institutions. And so on one hand, yes, you have these massive stadiums, and that's a huge problem. We saw this, like you said, in the World Cup, of course, with like soccer stadiums built in places that in Manaus where people can never get to again. Yeah. But you also have this about housing. You have this in terms of what is left after the games go, especially in terms of policing and those resources that don't just leave the community. Mm-hmm. And those are all the things that makes it so harmful. And I just wanted to add a point here about why this seems like such a hard question. There's a thing called sport washing, right? Sports is seductive. It draws us in. You talked about how we're enjoying the Olympics because you get these packaged narratives. And when you talk about cities saying, hey, we want to host the games, right? They're relying on this like fanfare around the romanticism of the Olympics to drum up lay support to bring this in line their own pockets. And that's a lot of the reasons, sports itself, that we're having this seeming tension between something people enjoy and something that's so destructive.
Taylor, let me show you this. The new norms, it's a games changer. This is from the International Olympic Committee. It feels like they are aware. They are not immune to the criticism. They know they are being criticised. They have had scandal after scandal after scandal. Have a look here, though. This is what they are saying. The complexity, the risk, the waste, the cost, delivering the Olympic Games, it's going to be much more value. There's going to be flexibility, there'll be partnership, efficiency, sustainability. That's the new norms. It's a games changer. The IOC are very punny here. All right, but what I want to do here is to take you, Taylor, to the Mayor of Brisbane, who was really pumped up about how the games, when they come to Brisbane, they're going to be different, they're going to be cheaper, and Brisbane can handle it. Have a listen to the Mayor.
Brisbane is a place that has been through a lot. It's been through natural disasters and floods, but it's always had that determined spirit and ambition. And today it is Brisbane's time to shine. This is a new era for Brisbane, but also a new era for the Olympic movement as well. We are so excited with this new model. The lower cost games, but supersizing the benefits. It's going to be so great for our city, our region and our state.
All right, Taylor, that Mayor looks sincere.
I'm sure he believes he's sincere. Unfortunately, I fear that determined spirit that he's talking about is probably more in line with the real estate interests in Brisbane, especially considering that this bid process was basically a closed bid process. When the games were awarded to Paris and to Los Angeles for 2024 and 2028, respectively, even those, there weren't really a lot of other competitors. There weren't many other cities that were willing to bring this Olympic Games into their environment. And the awarding of these games in 2032 is setting a new precedent for how far out these games are being awarded and how few people are involved in these bids, especially in the community. In fact, with our analysis in the Olympics, we feel like in order for a bid to even get to Olympic consideration at this point, there has to be quite a bit of backdoor wheeling and dealing with all sorts of different developers and people that kind of want to carve up these communities in the name of real estate and other really disgustingly moneyed interests. That's why one reason why we say we're no Olympics and not like reform Olympics is, again, these current Olympics have to be abolished as they are.
All right, let me bring in Dr. Sasha Mud. This comment is for you, Jules. When we're looking at reform, Dr. Sasha Mud is sceptical that even could be possible for the Olympics. Here she is.
As long as there are billions of dollars to be made in maintaining the status quo, it's very unlikely that serious and profound reform is going to be realistic. And that again suggests that a mass viewing boycott might be one of the few tools that could eventually shift the moral calculus on this question. The question then becomes, where are our moral priorities? How important is Olympic reform? And are individual viewers and individual people ready to make those viewing sacrifices in order to bring about this kind of moral change?
Really interesting point there. It actually relates to the new norms, because part of the problem is that the International Olympic Committee does a lot of fancy graphics and a lot of big statements from behind the press conference podium, but the reality doesn't really change that much. They have the new norms, they have the Olympic Agenda 2020, but the changes that they actually make tend to benefit the International Olympic Committee and don't address the issues that we've been talking about today. So the militarization of public space, the poor treatment of the unhoused, the forced gentrification and displacement of people that live in the city that won't be able to ever afford a ticket to the Olympics, the overspending, the greenwashing. And so I think that possibly a consumer boycott could have some kind of effect, but wow, it's really difficult to marshal that kind of support for a consumer boycott, especially when you think about it this way, that the Olympians are essentially workers. They're worker athletes within an unjust system. And so to abandon the Olympics and not to support those athletes is actually to kind of leave them in the cold in a particular way. Just one final quick point on this that I think is important context is that an important study came out from Ryerson University that compared the revenues that athletes from places like the National Basketball Association, the English Premier League of Soccer, football, the National Hockey League make compared to Olympians. In those other leagues, the athletes got between 45 and 60% of the revenues. Olympians, they got 4.1%. And so there's a lot of justice to be done for these athletes. And I'm not sure exactly just boycotting is going to help them in any kind of way.
I mean, I am worried that we are leaving the athletes out of this conversation. They're busy right now, right, over in Tokyo. So no one's got time to be on the stream right now. But the entire movement for abolishing the games as we know them, where do the athletes come into that conversation? Don't they have to be central to it? It's their Olympic Games.
Well, I think Jules was right on by talking about labor, right? To be able to understand athletic labor as labor means that we can have a conversation where we talk about workers in Qatar who are building World Cup stadiums for a World Cup that shouldn't be there. We can talk about the labor of athletes within these systems, and we can connect it instead of talking in silos. And sometimes that will come to points where it feels like you're working in opposite ways. But I think that one of the things that we know is many athletes, I've talked to many athletes even leading up to these games who wanted to talk about COVID concerns and not just about their health and safety, but hearing activists on the ground. I talked to many athletes after Rio who said, hey, we saw with our own eyes this destruction already. And that's putting them in a position now where they're saying, what do we do from our labor position? Right? How can we push these federations and how might we collaborate and raise some of these issues? And I think that it's usually an intersection or a kind of collaboration that feels intuitively like it doesn't work. But I actually think there's a lot of fruitfulness in that intersection because athletes are absolutely some of the people who are pushing the IOC the most on a range of issues. And the IOC, we need all hands on deck with them from multiple angles. And I think that there's a lot of fruitfulness in the convergence of interests. Certainly for many athletes, this remains a place that becomes very important politically. It becomes very important visibly. It becomes financially stable for them. But as Dr. Boykoff mentioned, that is not lucrative for very many people. And part of the concern that they're talking about with the IOC is the way that it breaks them, it exploits their labor, it leaves them for a variety of reasons very harmed. And that harm is what we can center and build off of to talk about the larger harm as well. They're absolutely an integral part of this conversation.
Yeah, if I could just jump in there real quick.
Please,
could I?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I think now is the exact moment to have those kind of conversations that Dr. Davis is pointing about with athletes, because for the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, all the participating athletes were essentially forced to sign a waiver that said in black and white letters that if they die of coronavirus or from heat exhaustion, that they cannot hold Olympic organizers liable. a Tokyo-bound athlete shared that waiver with me well in advance and was like, whoa, this thing is scary. You know, they've signed plenty of waivers over the course of their life. But that really jumped out to them that the International Olympic Committee does not have their interests at heart. And there are so many athletes now that are in that position, and they are organizing. There's a group called Global Athlete. There's a group called the Athletics Association of track athletes that are independent bodies that are actually organizing right now. So that's really exciting for athletes. I agree, they need to have a bigger seat at the table. Let's abolish the IOC and replace them with critical thinking athletes, and we could go a long ways in fixing this thing.
Amira's laughing, I'm laughing, Taylor's laughing. The IOC, that's I was going to say they're a little bit like Spectre in James Bond. They're a huge organisation and incredibly wealthy. That is a very old James Bond reference. Let me show you this here on my laptop, because yes, we are seeing a lot of comments on YouTube about the Olympics is kind of a waste of money. Let's have a look back at Athens. Athens spent almost 15 billion over its planned budget of 1.6 billion for the 2004 Summer Olympics. This is the rowing centre. That's what it looks like now-ish. Let me show you one more Olympic pool. This is the Olympic pool. This is just sad. This is really sad looking at this. I'm going to try one more idea and share it with you. And it comes from John. Have a listen, have a look, guess.
So my idea, I've been pushing this around for a number of years now, is to have a permanent site. Now, the advantages would be you would have fixed costs. You wouldn't need urban renewal every 4 years in major cities. Often that involves displacement of population. We saw this in Rio, we saw this in Atlanta, and we saw this in Beijing, where hundreds of thousands of people were displaced to provide the room for these stadiums, which a number of them continue to languish post-Olympics.
Oh, all right. Taylor, Olympics coming back to LA in 2028. If there was a permanent site, would you then be pro-Olympics?
Unfortunately, if the IOC, as they exist, is involved in any capacity, I can't really endorse any sort of permanent site.
You are so consistent, John.
A lot of people point to Athens, which was historically the home of the very original Olympic Games, as a potential site.
Taylor, excuse me, Taylor.
Oh, no. Yeah. But you could see there's so much devastation there. They went so over budget. And honestly, if the IOC was interested in building responsible sporting permanent infrastructure, they would have done so already. That's not really how the IOC operates. And unfortunately, the Olympic system is such an ongoing grift from city to city as they bounce around to these hosting sites. And it's integral that they come to these places. They sort of carve up real estate interests and stuff like that for outside interests. And they pull a lot of money out of these cities. And if they really wanted to exist somewhere permanently, they probably would have done so already, because there's a good chance it would get the Olympics to exist much longer.
George, you've travelled to so many Olympic host cities. The idea of a permanent home for the Olympics, is that just fantasy?
Unfortunately, it is, and it's again because of the International Olympic Committee. Just a few weeks back, I had the good fortune of debating mano a mano with the longest-serving member of the International Olympic Committee, a gentleman by the name of Richard Pound, and this very idea came up. It is circulating out there, and Mr. Pound just blew it off, had zero interest in it whatsoever. The International Olympic Committee believes it's spreading the gospel of Olympism around the world, and that locating the games in a single city would undermine that. So if you want to abolish the IOC first, which was kind of the original suggestion that I made, that might get you on the path to perhaps putting them in one city. But like you said, it's not even clear Athens would want them after the debacle last time. Some people have suggested Lausanne, Switzerland, where the International Olympic Committee is based. That might be a possibility, but still, it's a long shot.
Yeah. It's interesting because we had Richard Pound on the stream a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling us how safe the Olympics were going to be, particularly when we're talking about COVID. So we remember him from that show. We also reached out to the IOC to be on this particular discussion about should we be abolishing, rethinking the Olympic Games, and understandably they wanted nothing to do with this conversation. All right, Taylor, Amira, I shouldn't really laugh. Taylor, Amira, and Jules, thank you so much. Instagram and to our audience who are watching on YouTube, appreciate your questions and your thoughts. I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.